I'd like to talk about the book by sort of situating it in the context of a number of basic questions that we have to ask ourselves. So let's start with these very simple questions that we have to answer. Question number one. Is the United States out to establish an informal global empire? Informal global domination, hegemony? Yes or no? And I would suggest to you that the answer to this question is very simple and clear-cut. It's yes, especially since you have any number of liberals and even right-wing supporters of the United States foreign policy who are now saying, of course, that this is an empire that we have to establish. So that's question number one, the answer to which is yes, which has motivated this book. Question number two, is this good or bad? And here there's going to be a division. There are any number of people in the United States of America, in Britain, in Europe, in India, unfortunately, whose answer is basically yes, this is a good thing. Of course, the United States of America does bad things, it abuses and makes mistakes. Maybe Iraq is a mistake, like Vietnam was a mistake, but who can doubt the benignness of intent of the United States? If you like, the most sophisticated theoretical and intellectual case for saying yes, it was some variant of the other, what's called the hegemonic stability thesis, that you need to provide stability as a public good and so on. And those who have been motivated to contribute to this book, of course, their answer is no. And they are the most sophisticated case for saying that this is a bad thing, would be the left-wing Marxist understanding of imperialism, because there are variant understandings of imperialism itself. So one starts with the premise, yes, the United States is out to establish informal global hegemony. Two, this is a bad thing. Question number three, why do people pursue empire? Why do they want to build empire throughout history? And here the answer is really simple, because there's again always a substantial section of people, right, dominant classes, others and so on, who want to pursue and establish and accumulate power and wealth. That's why we do this. Similarly, now there are people, not just Americans, any number of Indian dominant classes here, there, etc., who want to. So when you talk about power and wealth, what you're then suggesting, of course, is that there is always an economic dimension to empire, and there's always a political dimension. And when you're talking about a global empire project, you're talking about a geo-economic dimension, and you're talking about a geopolitical dimension. And the geo-economic dimension, obviously, is the whole question of the neoliberal economic order. In the last 25 years, we've never seen anything like this in human history in terms of the incredible inequalities that have emerged. So whatever you may think about, oh, people at the poor have been benefiting, like you'll read by any number of people saying, the fact that there is such enormous inequality means that you have people throughout the world who have a vested interest in the continuation of this. That's your geoeconomics. Your geopolitics is obviously going to be connected to supporting and stabilizing that geoeconomic project, but it also has its own relatively independent dynamic. And we have one chapter here called in Bello, which is, if you like, pointed out the geoeconomic dimension here. But basically this is a book which deals more with the geopolitics of the American imperial project. And when we say geopolitics, what are we talking about? When we talk about geopolitics, we're talking about the effort to establish hegemony. And hegemony is a combination of force and consent. And therefore you have to organize the structures of force, and you have to organize the structures of consent. This book is not about the organization of the structures of force. If you like, there's always a hardware and a software of the empire project. What's the hardware of the American imperial project, of its effort at hegemony? The hardware is 740 odd military-related bases in over 140 countries, far, far more than ever existed during the whole of the Cold War period. The central political unit, as Chalmers Johnson has pointed out, I think correctly, is no longer the formal colonial unit. It is in fact the military base which enables them to move everywhere. And the other aspect of hardware is that all empires can only hope to establish and stabilize empire if they have a network of regional alliances of various kinds, which of course the United States is also seeking to do. And in order for you to be able to have and to stabilize that network of regional alliances, which includes India, which can also include the Russians and the Chinese as part of the larger project within this, all these efforts, is that you have to do two things. You have to address some of the material interests of those that you wish to bring over to your side. That is, you have to make their pockets feel good. But that's never enough. You also have to organize their consent. You have to capture their hearts, not just their pockets. In fact, the capturing of hearts and the organizing of consent is vital even for empire builders. Because empire builders never see themselves, whether it's the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the American Empire, whatever, Russian Empire, they never see themselves as nasty people who are out to exploit brutally people and all that. Forget about them. It's never quite like that. They always convince themselves that they're doing something good. So the organization of consent is very important for them. But it's particularly important, of course, because in modern era, it's not even enough for you to be able to organize consent among elites. You have to organize consent on a much deeper and wider scale than ever before. Because now you can have the phenomenon of the most militarily and economically powerful countries in the world losing politically because of the disjunction between politics and simply economic and military strength. The whole question of consent, Vietnam, what's happening in Iraq, decolonization, and so on. So, the organization of consent, and this book is basically about the software, the organization of consent. When we talk about the organization of consent in order to stabilize and establish the American imperial project, what are we talking about? There are three kinds of consent: active, passive, and bought. Active consent is the best. You actually believe that the United States of America is a force for good and is going to bring democracy and is going to fight against terrorism, and you must align yourself. And all colonial projects, British colonial projects, always succeeded in getting some people, in India for example, to say, well, you know, the British imperial project is doing good. They're helping us to set up the structures of democracy, so that's best. The second kind of consent will do. It's not as good as having Iraqi elite saying, you know, we must have the Americans in, or whatever. Second kind of consent is passive. What can you do? They're so strong. Resignation. You can't really fight them. That will do because they're not going to contest. And the third kind of consent is what is called bought consent. What are you going to give me? And a lot of what is considered to be sophisticated realpolitik diplomacy by governments is basically governments saying, what are you going to give me if I have to support you here? And then selling that to the public through what is called the national interest paradigm in many ways, okay? So that's the different forms of consent. The population zones in which you have to organize consent for the United States of America. 3 population zones. Very important, within the United States of America itself. You have to sell the American foreign policy imperial project to the American public. Number 2, within the target area, you have to try and convince the Iraqis and the others in the Middle East, middle classes, elites, and further below if you can, that what you're doing is good for them. And third, the rest of the world, Europe, China, India, the rest of your media, our media in India, everybody should come to understand that the Americans are doing a good thing, and therefore you have to organize consent in all these different population zones and these forms. What's happened, of course, is that during the Cold War, the United States of America's foreign policy behavior took place behind one overarching ideological banner, if you like, the organization of consent. And that was very effective, defending the free world against the communist threat. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, an American foreign policy behavior, which to the surprise of many has become even more aggressive. It shouldn't have been a surprise, but it has been a surprise to many. It has become even more aggressive. You can no longer use that ideological banner. And therefore what's happened is that the United States of America has had to highlight 6 ideological banners after the end of the Cold War.